Thank you very much for inviting me to this very special and also in many ways very reflective and sad day, where we remember Mr. Mittal, who not only has played a great role and a great part in India, but actually has really had in him the power to influence many things around the whole world. Honorable President of AICB, Honorable Secretary General of AICB, President of Asia Blind Union, distinguished guests, and all members of AICB. Today we are together to remember a great man and a great life. We are here to remember A.k Mittal, who left us all too soon, I think we can all agree. Mr. Mittal dedicated himself to the immense task of improving the lives of blind persons, actually of all persons, I believe, and not only in India, but in the world. I think we all remember Mr. Mittal in each our way. Many of you knew him much, much better than I do. But either way, he always left an impression and always left a feeling that if we could just stand together, if we could just move in the same direction, we could achieve so much more. The last time I met with Mr. Mittal was at the Africa Forum, actually, in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in 2019. And I remember very clearly sitting with him in the conference room there and having a cup of tea. And I remember all the great visions he had for how both the ICVI, where he was very active, but also the Worldline Union could move ahead. We were discussing things like how can we make sure that all members of Worldline Union have access to the information, to the knowledge that is required in order for sorry, I was being disturbed. In order for all members of Worldline Union to have access to global instruments, and he was having such a strong vision. Now, I'm deeply honored to be standing here today as the first of hopefully in a long line of lecturers on this special occasion. This is a chance to remember Mr. Mittal. I'm also very humbled to stand here today because I stand here as his successor to the post of Secretary General in the World Blind Union. Now, this was a post I never anticipated at all. This was a post that Mr. Mittal was very well suited for and filled with dedication and integrity and empathy for the past 4 years before his passing away. Now, all I can hope is that I can, in time, become a worthy successor. And all I can hope is that I have paid enough attention and learned enough for that. Now, the title of this talk today, the title of this talk today, as was mentioned before, is the globalization and the role of international NGOs in the context of developing countries. This is a very big title in some ways, but I shall try to kind of focus on the role and the work of the World Blind Union, and try to give you some insights into what the World Blind Union is trying to do, and also how the World Blind Union hopefully will push and keep pushing the agenda also for development in the future. The first question to raise, however, is why do we need global organizations? Why is it not enough that we have AICB, we have Danish Association of the Blind, and so on? Do they really have a role to play? And are they worth the resources that we put into these organizations? My personal belief is that global organizations are critical in addressing the issues that not any one country or continent can handle. This can be issues of climate change. This can be issues of the COVID pandemic, which we are all struggling with at the moment. This can be humanitarian crisis, and not least issues of poverty. These issues cannot be resolved by any one country alone. These issues cannot be resolved by any one organization alone. But, and there is a but, even though we have global organizations like the World Blind Union to address these issues, we always need to look at the price we pay for these organizations up against in the lives of individuals. We need to ask ourselves, are individuals being moved by these efforts? Now, if, for example, we look at an instrument like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we need to ask, have all the efforts being made by global organizations and by the UN and by the organizations of persons with disabilities who pushed very hard for this convention, is it moving people? Is it moving people out of poverty? Is it moving people into education? Is it giving us access to voting, to participating, to information, and so on? And only when we can say that, yes, individuals are being moved, blind and partially sighted around the world are actually now struggling a little less, having a little more access, then we can say that global organizations like the World Blind Union have a role to play and has some worth. And I think we should all keep this in mind, and we all need to make this reality check, because otherwise we can very easily get caught up in big instruments, in a lot of documents and a lot of talking. But we need to move back to practicality sometimes and just take stock of the situation. Mr. Mittal was acutely aware of this. He never lost himself at any point in time, I think, to the big global agendas. He was always very mindful of what would be the gain of people. How would life be changed? What could be done? This awareness was very evident in his dedication, for example, in ICVI and the World Organization for Education of Visually Impaired People on the one hand, but also, and as we have heard with the tributes being paid today, his dedication to the success and achievement of individual students and of staff and of members of the organization of AICB in India. Or put in other words, we need to make sure that the interests of blind and partially sighted people are always put at the heart of global agendas. And we need to take these steps. Yet, we always also need national organizations. The World Blind Union is worth nothing without its members, and the members are the organizations around the world. And I will get back to this in a minute. So the role and mandate of the World Blind Union. The World Blind Union is an international, non-governmental, non-profit organization. It was founded in 1984. So in fact, it will be 40 years old in 3 years' time. It was established as a conglomerate, a coming together of different organizations, often for the blind. And they came together in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And the first constitution for the World Blind Union is actually dated 26th of October 1984. The World Blind Union was established as an attempt to create one voice of blind people just around the world. It was really felt at the time, and I think we all share this feeling today, that as blind and partially sighted people, we need to have our own voice, and we need to carry this voice wherever decisions are being made in the world. It's not enough to have our own individual voices. We need to make sure we get heard where the decisions affecting our lives are made. And for that reason, the World Blind Union was established as a place where blind and partially sighted people could come together and could raise that voice. It was also created in a response to more and more initiatives being made at a global level. As the UN gained momentum, as we have the World Health Organization, as we have the World Bank, and so on, these organizations make critical decisions all the time that also affects the lives of blind and partially sighted persons, and therefore we needed this organization. One of the, or two of the key words being connected very strongly with the World Blind Union are unity and solidarity. Blind and partially sighted stand united in this organization, and it is for those of you who have been attending General Assemblies or World Blind Union meetings, you should all have experienced how, regardless of cultures, religions, gender, level of education, and so on, one thing that can always unite is what we share. The fact that we come together and share one disability. I have never experienced this so strong in any other group, actually. And whenever attending meetings, I always go back home to Denmark and think there is some kind of hope in the world, and there is some kind of hope for us because we have that sense of unity and solidarity. The World Blind Union recognizes that the needs of blind and partially sighted persons should be met regardless of geography. And this is well reflected in very many of the initiatives of the organization. It's also well reflected in the fact that the World Blind Union has a structure and committees dedicated particularly to developing issues. During the current COVID pandemic, the need for unity has become even greater and is very well reflected in the survey actually made by the World Blind Union on how blind and partially sighted persons are faring during the pandemic and how the pandemic has affected the lives of all of us. What this survey has found are the difficulties for many people to meet basic needs, to have access to food, to get access to water, and to get access to basic health care and to protective measures in the sense of sanitation, in the sense of face masks. What is also really difficult is keeping the distances required in many countries. Many blind and partially sighted people all over the world, and regardless of whether they are in a developing country or if they are in the developed part of the world, have reported being isolated and being cut off from the network and the surroundings which usually assist them in their daily lives. Now, we all know this, I'm sure, because we have all faced one way or the other the consequences, the terrible consequences of the COVID pandemic. However, creating this survey, documenting the difficulties, particularly of blind and partially sighted persons around the world, is extremely important, because those reports can be used, for example, when influencing states, when influencing organizations who can assist in providing some of these basic, essential facilities that we require. So we need this. Now, not only does the World Blind Union work, of course, with surveys, the World Blind Union also has a very, very strong focus on human rights, on the fact that we as blind and partially sighted people have and should observe human rights like everybody else. I will get back to this. Just briefly, I would like to state to you what the objectives of the World Blind Union are. And they are stated as to protect and promote human, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of blind and partially sighted people, to enable blind and partially sighted persons to join together and express their views and aspirations, and in accordance with democratically adopted decisions, to take collective actions to work towards the advancement and well-being of blind and partially sighted people, with the goal of equalization of opportunities and full participation in society, if necessary, by special legal or administrative measures. The objective of the World Blind Union is also to strengthen the self-awareness of the blind and partially sighted persons, to develop their personality, self-respect, and sense of responsibility, to provide an international forum for the exchange of knowledge and experience in the field of blindness, and to work for the prevention of blindness. So as you can see from this, the World Blind Union really seek to address very many of the issues facing blind and partially sighted persons all over the world. And getting back to the point I was beginning with, this requires unity. This requires that we work together across borders and across continents. Now, the World Blind Union was also established as, and I quote again, representing and being the only authentic voice of all people with blindness or partial sight throughout the world. Now, this, for me at least, means that the World Blind Union has a very large responsibility to ensure that we listen to all member organizations, and to ensure that there is a very fine balance, making sure that issues faced by people all over the world, by blind people all over the world, are actually addressed. Currently, the World Blind Union has 350 member organizations. And of course, we don't have 350 countries or nations in the world. And this is because some nations have several member organizations, but 350 member organizations all working to address the issues of blind people. The World Blind Union is represented in several UN working groups and committees, and is also part of the International Disability Alliance, IDA, which is a global umbrella organization constituted by the global organizations within each disability group, or within each disability. Now, this was a lot of This was a lot of talking about what should the World Blind Union do, but that doesn't bring us any closer to what I started this lecture by saying, which is how does this impact on the lives of individuals? So we can say all this, but only if we can also impact the lives of individuals one way or the other, will we have succeeded in the role that has been laid out for the World Blind Union in the Constitution. Now, so talking a little bit about what actually could be the impact of the World Blind Union. In India, you have a very prominent economist and philosopher, Amartya Sen. He was a Nobel laureate in 1998, when he also the year after that published his work, Development as Freedom. His claim is, or was at the time, that development can not only be seen as securing better income. Development has to be measured and has to be viewed as the extent to which people have access to different kinds of freedoms. Now, in many ways, and thinking about the situation faced by people with disabilities, and particularly by us as blind and partially sighted persons, this way of thinking makes a lot of sense. Because which are the freedoms we do not have access to? Which are the freedoms that we are still lacking? And by posing this question, actually the idea becomes, of course, much more complex, but also it becomes much more relevant. It's not just about money, it's about many things. For example, we are free, or we are more free when we can participate. When we, for example, can vote, when we can go to school, when we have a livelihood and can support ourselves, when we have access to healthcare, when we can move around, when we have access to mobility, one way or the other. If we do not have all these possibilities, freedoms, you can say, even if we had the most wealth in the world, what use would that be? So thinking about this, and in a sense, achieving freedom is the objective of the World Blind Union, and what we should strive for all blind and partially sighted persons to be free. And moving further and moving a little closer to the present time, these freedoms are also well reflected in, for example, the Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which exactly talks about how we should have the rights to all the areas that I just mentioned before. So so we can be free. And how do we do that then as the World Blind Union? Now, for one thing, in order to make our claims significant, we need data. We need basically to be counted, to be seen. I hope that makes sense. If we don't know how many blind people are there, how can we move to a ministry? How can we move to the UN? How can we move anywhere and claim that there are issues facing the blind? If we do not know how many blind children are not in school, how can we claim that as an issue? So data and gathering information about what it means to be blind in the different societies around the world is actually extremely important and essential to our possibilities for advocating for our rights. Now, the Washington Group has developed questions to ensure that data is also now collected on disabilities in different countries or in the countries around the world. So instead of saying, do you have a disability? Now they ask, what kind of disability do you have? So that data should hopefully give us information about what is the situation for blind people, because I don't know if you noticed, but very often when people ask how many blind people are there in the world, and we say the UN estimates that there is about 285 million people in the world who are blind or partially sighted. But very often the discussion stops there because we don't know really what happens to these people. Hopefully now we will know more about this. And for example, we need to know this to understand how the work with the Sustainable Development Goals is moving blind people. Are we included when different nations, different initiatives are being made to ensure that the world is developing? If we don't ask about blind people, we will not know about blind people. And there is a great concern that maybe the blind are not always being moved or included in the way that we could. So data is one thing. And I would like to just give you a brief example of how this data collection can really make a difference. As was said in the introduction, at the moment I'm in Uganda, and I'm here together with the Uganda National Association of the Blind. And we are looking at what happens to refugees who come into Uganda from neighboring countries because they had to take refuge from conflicts. Now, when entering Uganda as a refugee, you are put into different categories. You are registered, and it's determined whether you are in the category of a person with special needs. However, not much else is registered at the beginning, which basically means that if you are in a category of a person with special needs, you can be elderly, you can be an unaccompanied minor, you could be a single mother, or you could be a person with a disability, even a blind person. So just to say, if we stop the registration, we stop the data with person with special need, how will anyone know which facilities are actually needed? Would it be houses for the unaccompanied minors? Would it be provisions for the elderly, or would it be braille books for the schools so the blind children can attend? So this is just an example. And my point here is these questions that have now been developed that should now go into national censuses being made around the world, should go into the way different nations are registering data on their populations. These questions developed and put into the work of the Washington Group. They did not come out of nothing. They came because international organizations, including the World Blind Union, was making a strong case, were strong advocates for disability to be included. Because believe me, most nations would rather not have to go into that issue, because of course, every time you include a new issue, you make the questionnaire more complex. You make the data gathering a more complex process. So data is one thing that the World Blind Union is very aware of, and which kind of gives justification to having an international NGO. Another thing is that the World Blind Union is continually seeking to influence the work that is being done on international instruments. I could mention here, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals have to be achieved, is the ambition, before 2030. We have less than 9 years to go. According to the goals laid out, no one should be left behind. However, what does it mean not to leave anyone behind? Within this very complex instrument and this complex set of goals, objectives, and targets, a few of these actually address disability. And the WBU always seek to bring attention to the critical issues of the SDGs. For example, by being part of a high-level group meeting every year in the UN to discuss the implementation and to discuss the progression of the goals. At the same time, all WBU member nations, member countries, are strongly encouraged to take part in producing reports outlining how the SDGs are being met and how we as blind and partially sighted people are being included in our nations. The WBU has even facilitated that some member organizations have got access to training on how to make these reports. Now, another key instrument, as we are all aware, is of course the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This convention, the WBU was strongly advocating, and of course it was a milestone when it was finally adopted by the UN General Assembly. Today we have several blind persons on the CRPD committee, and there are numerous examples of WBU member organizations contributing to the alternative reports and to the reports being made in the different nations around the world in order to highlight what is the situation of the blind in that country. I know you in India have made very strong contributions also. I know you have commented heavily on the lack of provision of Braille materials and access to education for blind and partially sighted children in India. And I really commend you for this effort, because only by bringing this forward, by bringing to the CRPD committee what is the situation of blind and partially sighted children, for example, only then can that committee assist in advocating our case, pushing this case, letting, in this case, the Indian government know that more provisions have to be made. So the CRPD is a cornerstone in all work being done at the World Blind Union. The final thing I would like to mention is that the World Blind Union is also very mindful of humanitarian action, very mindful of blind people also being part of people being displaced, of people having to take refuge and leave their home and leave their security behind. The World Blind Union is part of a reference group on what is called the Interagency Standing Committee on Disability in Humanitarian Action. Interestingly, very few of the big organizations working with humanitarian action, like the Red Cross and Save the Children and so on, have addressed issues of disability in any large-scale way in the past. But what has happened now and what this standing committee has delivered is actually a set of guidelines outlining both how persons with disabilities should be included when setting up programs of humanitarian action, but also, and this I think is really a milestone, highlighting how organizations of persons with disability need to be involved whenever humanitarian action is being delivered. This means that it is recognized that there are advocates needed, for example, advocates of the rights of blind people, that humanitarian action to, for example, blind people shouldn't just be delivered on a case-by-case basis, but actually should be part of the system, and attention needs to be gotten or be given also to organizations of the blind. Now, these are guidelines, and as I mentioned, the World Blind Union has a place in the working group or in the reference group for these guidelines. However, now is the time to see how the guidelines will be implemented into practice. So we are all holding our breath and hoping that the mainstream organizations who have also been part of developing these guidelines will also allocate the necessary resources to put these guidelines into practice and to actively seek out partnerships and seek out consultation with organizations of the blind in countries where humanitarian action is required. So this was a little bit about some of the large global instruments actually having the possibility to affect all of our lives, and to which the World Blind Union is dedicating time and resource to the extent at all possible. Now, I would just like to also mention another branch of the work of the World Blind Union, which is related to what was also stated in the objective of the organization, sharing of knowledge and experience. The World Blind Union is in the process of developing a knowledge platform through actually support of various donors. And this platform is intended to support member organizations working with the different large-scale global instruments and generally human rights and advocacy. The platform will contain 3 levels. There will be access to information on all these instruments. So instead of going to the numerous various sites of UN and other international bodies, websites which are not necessarily accessible, which can only be reached with difficulty, it will be possible to go to the World Blind Union website to obtain a lot of information on how to work with sustainable development goals, how to work with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and so on. So this platform will hold a lot of information relevant to organizations of the blind around the world. The platform will also give the possibility for member organizations to share experiences. So for example, when you at AICB have a lot of experience in writing alternative reports for the CRPD committee, maybe you would like to share your experience with some of the organizations who have less experience, who are unsure of how to handle what can really seem a monumental task. The platform will also give access to working spaces, so that if members wish to work together across continents, across nations, this should be possible. So the final thing I would like to say about the World Blind Union, and maybe actually the most important thing, is that the World Blind Union is here also to nurse, to encourage, and to strengthen partnerships. The World Blind Union has itself a number of partners, for example, International Disability Alliance, which I mentioned, and through which we regularly get access to projects and funding. The Worldline Union is a partner with CBM Global, which has assisted the Worldline Union in developing what's called the Accessibility Go Guide, which is a guide to accessibility. And the Worldline Union is also closely connected to the UN Habitat, working strongly to influence thoughts on development of urban spaces and infrastructures. But the Worldline Union is also an arena for forging friendships and understanding across the globe. And one example is the partnership between AICB and DAB. Actually, as organizations, we have known each other for many, many years. And Mr. Mittal, who we are here to remember, was a very, very strong advocate, and he was just very good at establishing partnerships and creating friendships across the world, as has also been mentioned. So even though the partnership that we now have, which includes a project and funding and so on, was only established in 2019 formally, informally, and through the work of the Worldline Union, we have known each other for many years, and we have known that we share a lot of thinking, we share a lot of values, and we share the desire for pushing the agenda for blind and partially sighted persons. Now, the role of our current partnership and what we do now is, of course, to strengthen the relation to AICB affiliates and members through localization and rehabilitation of blind and partially sighted in a number of districts here in India. And this hopefully, and now we're back to the individual, should give blind and partially sighted the possibility to come together locally, to support each other and to build their capacity. Now, I would like to conclude this lecture to say that the slogan of the Worldline Union is change what it means to be blind. We all do this, or try to do this, with all that we have every day. There is no doubt that we have a long way to go, both as the Worldline Union, but also as national organizations of the blind. And to go there, we need to go together. We need to share the commitment. We need to share the agendas. We need to show solidarity towards each other, and we need dedication. Much of this we could learn from the actions of Mr. Mittal. All these words describe him very accurately. He was a dedicated person, and a person to which I think we all owe a lot. Now, I think it is appropriate that following the event today, we all take some time to reflect on how we can proceed, how we can stand together, and how we can continue the great work that Mr. Mittal was paving the way for. We need international organizations. We need to be present where decisions are made, whether it is at local level in the village or at the UN headquarters in New York. We also need to move the lives of individual blind children, blind men, blind women, and empower them to take charge of their own lives. Now our challenge is to find the right balance and to stay united as blind and partially sighted persons, even when things are not always moving our way. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for letting me be here today. And I hope to see all of you somewhere in the world in the future. Thank you very much.